You know, the Bible is among the tested best for how to live grace-filled, hopeful, satisfying, joy-spreading lives. In my opinion, here's what the heart of the Bible is. Welcome a stranger, feed the hungry, heal the sick, don't kill, go in peace. Your list might be different, and I didn't make that up. That's a distillation of decades of reading theologians and biblical commentaries, living, questioning, and learning, sometimes the hard way. If only things were that clear. If only faith really could fit on a bumper sticker. And for some people it does. To them, at least on one issue, things are crystal clear. There's Reverend John Schweibert of Portland, Oregon, and his wife, who since 1977, and this is an older story, so they may be dead now, I don't know, refused to pay what they considered to be the military portion, the support for defense spending, of their taxes. They gave that money to the county instead. I guess they felt strongly about that. The Reverend Paul Stallsworth has spent virtually his entire ministry opposing Roe v. Wade. And he felt so called by God that he didn't care what the people in his parish thought about his opinion or how loud he was about it. I guess he felt strongly. But would you invite them to your birthday party? I suppose if you want to start a fight, yeah. And if you're like me, maybe you had a gut reaction to one of those stories. I'll bet you didn't like one of those people, or maybe even both of them. Maybe you started an argument in your head with one of them. I did, with both of them. I mean, do the Schweiberts really mean to deprive veterans of their retirement and health benefits? Because more than half of government military spending goes to support the health and retirement benefits of veterans. How is not giving them what they need to care for themselves a good idea? Okay, I'm going to stop there about that, because I could just get into a rant. And Stallsworth, does he really believe women can't think for themselves and people of faith can't make their own decisions and that everybody should live according to his religion? How do we have civil relationships, let alone love one another, when we can get impassioned about things and then sometimes lose our compassion when we do it? Loving one another is hard. Loving one another is hard. And if you want to live as if all you need is love, you're going to quickly find you need a lot of other things too. Patience, tolerance, grace, and the ability to question your assumptions and listen with curiosity instead of judgment. Question your assumptions and listen with curiosity instead of judgment. And this has become harder and harder and harder for all of us in the last 50 years. Can you put the slide up? This is a slide that shows the 1992 election map for landslide counties. So all the white space is a county where they voted red or blue, it doesn't tell you, but it was not a landslide. So in 1992, this is how many, and try not to get distracted by how big the space is, because some of those big spaces, especially in the middle of the country, don't indicate a lot of people. You don't need to worry about that. What I want to show you is the contrast between this and the next slide. That is the 2004 election map. Only look at the white. Do you see how the non-landslide counties have shrunk? Go back, if you can. Can you go back? Thanks. Lots of counties where it's not a landslide. Next. Very few counties where it's not a landslide. I'm sure you can see what Bill Bishop was noticing in his 2008 book called The Big Sort. He says, Americans have been self-separating themselves. In the last 50 years, Americans have been forming ideological tribes. Not necessarily racial tribes, not necessarily religious tribes, not necessarily even economic tribes, ideological tribes. They go to their neighborhoods or their churches and volunteer groups with people who think the way they do. And over the last 50 years, there's been more and more and more of that. Now that's not how we would describe what we're doing. In every corner of society, people are creating more and more homogeneous relationships because it feels better. Everyone wants to feel like they belong. Everyone wants to feel like they belong. And we feel like we belong when we're with people who think and look and act like us. So what's the problem with this? What is the problem with this? Well, social psychologists have studied this, and what happens when we worship in homogeneous groups, ideologically homogeneous groups, when we worship, when we work and live, particularly live in homogeneous, ideologically homogeneous places, people get the same information all the time. As people hear, listen to me now, as people hear their beliefs and opinions reflected back to them, their opinions become more rigid and more extreme. This is a social study that's been done, a sociological study. When we hear our beliefs echoed back to us, our beliefs become more rigid and more extreme. Now, the internet knows this. The internet is not neutral. It has an algorithm that will get you to click and click and click and click, and it'll feed you what you most want, especially the stuff that makes you a little frosty because you're going to click more on those. Or if you're an English teacher, as I was once, I'll remind you, if you're only reading from 2 sources that you already like, your English teacher would tell you that is not a well-researched paper. And the reason I say this is because this is one of the biggest obstacles even the best intentioned people struggle with if we want to act as if all you need is love in the way of Jesus. Maybe you were here when the Reverend Lindsay Bell Kerr joined us a couple of years ago, and she led a weekend workshop called Good Conversations. They told a story that really stuck with me, and it stuck with some of the community members and church members who went to those workshops. They told a story, and maybe it stuck with me because it was really close to home for me. Lindsay and their wife are not gun enthusiasts. They believe in regulation, a lot of regulation. They don't own a gun, and they don't have one in their home. By contrast, her brother is an enthusiastic hunter and owns and keeps guns. Now, maybe you have a situation like this in your family or with friends. I have a brother who insists that only a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with a gun, and we were having a fight about that one day because we fight about our politics all the time. And I said, is that a fact? Is there actually evidence for that? Show me a sociological study that is actually a fact. And he said, well, I don't know if it's a fact. I said, well, then it's just an opinion. Don't worry. We do this all the time. We're fine with each other. But when I heard Lindsay told the rest of this story about their brother, I had to look at my way of relating with my brother, whom I love. And he loves me, and we don't have trouble. We just disagree about some things. Lindsay chose to approach their conversation with their brother with curiosity instead of trying to win an argument. This was a new concept for me. Turns out, after a calmer, more curiosity-driven conversation, some of you may remember her telling us this story, they discovered they actually had a core value at the bottom of They had a core value in common, and that was the safety of their families. Lindsay and their wife felt that having no guns in the house was safer for their family. Their brother felt that having some well cared for, locked up, responsibly handled guns kept their family safe. Isn't that interesting? I don't think either one of them changed the other one's mind, but it sure brought the temperature down, and they began to see one another not as on the opposite side of an important, essential issue, but as someone with a concern in common and a differing understanding of how to address that concern. And yes, I had a conversation later with my brother. Love is lived out in hospitality and community. Love is lived out in hospitality and community. And the smaller and more homogeneous the ideology of our community, the less likely we are to love the people Jesus asks us to love. If what you want is only good for you and is not good for anybody else, it's not love. If what you want is only good for you and not for anybody else, it's not love. In the late 70s, what an interesting time. I ran across this quote from a guy named Fritz Perls. He's the founder of the Gestalt School of Psychotherapy, which really doesn't matter. It was very popular. It was one of those things that was on a lot of college posters on college walls, and it was very hip and cool to have this poem up. And here it is. I hated it. I still find it really, really annoying. See what you think. I do my thing and you do your thing. That's not the worst. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations. Well, there's some truth in that. And you are not in this world to live up to mine, and some of us need to remember that too. You are you and I am I. And if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. And it does sound a little hippy-dippy. But to me, when I read that, it implied that I don't have any responsibility toward anybody but myself. I mean, that's what I heard. I don't think that's what he meant. He was probably trying to help people differentiate from others because they do too much of what other people think they ought to do. I don't know. I never asked him. But there was nothing in that poem about our interdependence, about hospitality, about community. I'm not sure what the point of it is, except to warn us off of expectations. And that's a good thing, because expectations are just resentments looking for a place to happen. And some of us do need to understand that we are unhappy because other people don't do what we want them to do all the time. And some of us need to stop doing that. But mostly I thought, this is how we wander down the wrong path. We wander down. There are powers and principalities working against growing the community of God, and sometimes they even show up in poetry, in something that looks lovely and sounds pretty and that we can even feel good about. But there's a lot of stuff out there, and it's not always what you think, and some of it's stuff that you like that works against what God has called us to do. And I think part of what we do if we want to live into all you need is love and act as if we were doing that, is we need to look at some of the obstacles that show up and why there is hope in spite of those. And it's hard to live into the teachings of Jesus and really live as loving people. Of all the miracles contained in the New Testament, maybe one of the best miracles is that this little ragtag batch of people lurking around Jesus with nothing to show for it much, somehow, after his death, managed to lay the groundwork for the foundations of a faith that is all about love. It may not always look like it, but we know that that's the core teaching. How did it happen? How did it happen that this tattered remnant could weave itself into the robe of Christ? The answer is found, I think, at least in part, in the last chapter of the Gospel of John, when Jesus has died, and the disciples have gone back to what they know, which is fishing. So back to work they are, and they'd been out fishing, and this is verse 9. When they'd gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. It's always nice when somebody makes your breakfast, isn't it? And Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish. And Jesus said, "Come and have breakfast." Now, none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. And that was the third time Jesus had shown himself to some of the disciples. And when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And Simon Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." A second time, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon Johnson, do you love me?" And Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And then Jesus said, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter felt hurt because he'd said it 3 times, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Feed my sheep." That's who we're called to be, sheep feeders. Recognizing the powers and principalities that mitigate against most people was one of the hallmarks of Jesus' ministry and teaching. He recognized that the vast majority of folks were prevented from having a healthy, happy, prosperous life. And that continues to our day, that an enormous number of people who ought not to be deprived of the capacity to live a happy, healthy, prosperous life are. And so Jesus does the most befuddling thing possible. He puts Peter in charge. Have you read the Gospels? Peter. Well, that's just another sermon for another day. But Peter's now in charge of continuing the mission. And what is the mission? What is the mission? One more time. What is the mission? Now, you understand that's a metaphor, right? That I'm not asking you to go get sheep, literal sheep, right? Just so we're clear. All right? If you don't understand that metaphor, talk to me afterwards. But notice, the mission is not take care of your own family and friends and let others fare for themselves. The mission is not help those who demonstrate that they deserve help. That one I struggle with. Feed my sheep indeed. A lot of days I feel more like a sheep myself who's nibbled my way well off the Jesus path, especially because my culture bombards me with contrary information. Also, I love new shoes. But their secret was no secret. The early Christian believers believed in walking into hell. They devoted themselves wholeheartedly, and some of them did ridiculous things, selling everything they had and living communally. It really didn't work, did it? But, you know, you got to admire the aspirational nature of that. We don't really know how much of that they did versus other more ordinary-looking things, but they did something that got them crosswise of people, and then they grew. Do you know how the Christian church really grew? It was just a smattering of nobodies all across the Roman Empire. And then in Rome, in the late 200s, there were several bouts of plague, and everybody who had the capacity to do so moved out to the countryside except the Christians. They stayed in the city and took care of their neighbors and friends. And when the rest of Rome saw that, the word spread, and people began to flock to Christianity, and it began to grow. Somehow, in the hell of people's difficult lives, Christians built communities of hope. They cared for other people across cultural and class lines. And sometimes, let's face it, going to hell is terrifying enough just walking out your front door. And each of us has our own description of hell: loneliness, poverty, addiction, clinical depression, oppression, bigotry. Once in a while, it does me good to remember that all God asks is that we go to hell and give our all. That we build a community where God can come right into our hell and lead us out into the light. That we check ourselves before we judge others, and that we do everything in our power to live as if all you need is love. So today I want to say thank you for giving yourself to this community today and every day in our joint effort to live as if all you need is love. Thank you that you keep the doors of this church wide open, calling us out into the world and inviting those who need love and care and belonging in those doors. We do it together. We really do.